Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, September 9th. We will hear the presentation Centering Equity, Framing Effective Approaches. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel there. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, you can just type those in your questions box and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, our host is the private practice division of APA, so thanks to you all for joining us. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM equity credits. You can log your credits by going to planning.org, logging into your MyAPA account. That's planning.org/MyAPA. Log in, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you are on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That is where I post any important date or time changes. I also post when new sessions are available to register for, and I try to send updates each week of our upcoming Friday session. And we record all of our sessions. We post them onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to head over to YouTube, subscribe to our channel so that you'll be notified when a new session is up. If you head over there, you will notice that we have well over 400 recordings available to you all for free. So again, like I said, if you have any questions for our panelists today, just type them in your questions box and we will get to those at the end during the Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Ramona Malehi to kick things off. Ramona.
Yay, thank you, Christine. Welcome everybody to the session on centering equity, framing effective approaches. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare the inequities and disparities in our country. In this session, we will explore how we can deliver better outcomes for all by intentionally centering equity in the ecosystem of public investments, programs, resources, and policies. These approaches are about how we make a difference in improving the quality of life and opportunities for every person in our community, and how to promote equity in workplace culture, professional practice, and community planning. The first approach to centering equity is the whole family approach to family well-being, centering the whole family together, or in Hawaii, ohana nui. Next. Our value system determines our priorities, guides our interactions with others, establishes our behavior. An integral part of Hawaiian culture is the care and nurturing of family, or ohana. Hawaiians embrace the opportunity of living in the company of an extended family. To Hawaiians, family is not just blood. It's recognizing that we're all related, we're all ohana, we are family. Next. Consequently, embracing the whole family approach by lifting children and parents in their lives together is an opportunity to align siloed health and human service programs focused exclusively on either the child, such as early childhood development, or on the parent, such as workforce programs, and instead to seamlessly work for and with families, to pursue goals to help them thrive and unlock new possibilities, and overall have a greater impact on the public dollars spent. Next. There are 5 core areas for helping families thrive: social capital, health and well-being, economic assets, education, both early childhood and K-12, post-secondary employment and employment pathways. In June 2021, ASCEN released its summary of the state of the field, including stories, accomplishments, insights, and recommendations for action. Since 2010, ASCEN, which is with the Aspen Institute, has served as the policy advocate and national innovation hub for the diversity of 2-gen programs advance in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Next. Ohana Nui is Hawaii's adaptation of the whole family approach. It's multi-generational, multicultural, delivering integrated human services covering keiki, children, parents, kupuna seniors, and persons with disabilities. It is administered by the Hawaii State Department of Human Services and their Benefits Employment Support Services Division. Ohana Nui translates and transforms human services to human potential. As a footnote, Hawaii is first in the nation in the number of multi-generational families. Next. The social determinants of health are the drivers of family well-being. The 5 pillars of Ohana Nui include housing, food and nutrition, health and wellness, education and economic stability, and social capital. More than 50% of children are served by the Department of Human Services federally funded programs, SNAP, TANF, child care subsidies, Medicaid, and state-funded programs such as Preschool Open Doors. Next. To ensure that the department's internal transformation, the breaking of the silos, is sustainable, the Ohana Nui approach is now the law in Hawaii, enabled by our governor in 2019. Next. Intentional transformation of the Department of Human Services' internal culture has taken some critical steps to adapting to Ohana Nui. Recognizing and appreciating that institutional culture takes time, the Department of Human Services leadership worked with supervisory staff to translate large strategic goals to workable daily activities. They invested in professional development. They created a tier of leaders of change. They instituted on-the-ground engineers and internal champions. They developed pilot projects to nurture partnerships with a broad external network to provide more wraparound services. They modernized the IT systems, and they streamlined business practices and processes. Next. Some of the lessons that were gleaned from the pandemic centered around leadership, flexibility, and partnerships. Accommodating staff required register administrators and supervisors to maintain flexibility by acknowledging staff family and home life needs, their challenges and adjustments. The transition to a working digital platform was swift due to the ongoing organizational change management activities, the IT modernization, and work towards the integrated service delivery. And finally, with federal waivers, DHS was able to maintain the revenue of contracted service providers, even if programs were closed. Staff worked with providers to modify the scope of services to adjust to COVID-19 mitigation requirements. Next. On the ground, external facing, the emphasis was on delivering programs faster and through a one-door access philosophy, changing mindsets, shifting systems, and committing to equity through a cultural lens. An example is the cross-sector collaboration on the No Kid Hungry Grant Initiative to improve access to WIC and SNAP and to consider the use of more traditional culture foods. And also healthcare access for residents from the Compact of Free Association States, or COFA, proved the first in the country to implement Medicaid eligibility. Next. Another example is the Kauai Loa Youth and Family Wellness Center, which is used as a pu'u honua, or place of healing, to transform juvenile justice. Next. And the newest initiatives from the Hawaii's 2022 legislative session added 2 key initiatives. One, a $500 monthly rental supplement to TANF and TANF families. Most TANF and TANF families, as you know, are led by women. And the second initiative is a family resource center at Waiawa Correctional Facility to provide trauma-informed services and assist families during incarceration, and when an incarcerated parent re-enters the communities. Studies indicate, of course, that parental incarceration impacts a child's emotional and physical well-being, household economic stability, and long-term health implications. Next. And finally, a good introduction on equity actions is APA's Planning for Equity Policy Guide. It's a tremendous resource for inspiration. It offers an equity lens on cross-cutting topics and areas of planning, and I encourage you to read. Next. Finally, up next are my fellow speakers. On aging and gender dynamics in planning will be Mildred Warner from Cornell, Pink Lining from Andy Miklo, and Aging in Queer Place from Marissa Tursky. Take it away, Mildred.
Thank you very much, Ramona. And I'm very pleased to talk to you all today about work on aging and gender dynamics in planning. And I want to acknowledge that Andy Miklo and Marissa Tursky, who will be presenting later, were also very active participants in this work. Next. So when we think about equity and gender, we've done a number of collaborations to promote change. Most importantly, our collaboration with the Women in Planning Division of the APA. We held focus groups at the National Planning Conference back in 2014, and from that emerged a Planning for Women in Aging survey, which we did in 2014, and Andy Miklo helped to analyze, and then a Workplace Dynamics survey, which we ran in 2015, and Marissa Tursky helped to analyze. Then I followed this up in 2019 with a survey of city managers across the country with the International City County Management Association. And then most recently, this spring, my students did a review of 80 of the comprehensive plans that said they addressed gender issues in that survey. Next. So the idea here is that we could promote attention to gender equity through the increased attention that planners are giving to aging. So giving attention to aging might give us more of a gender lens on planning. Why might that be? Because women are the primary caregivers still in our society for children and for older adults, and the majority of older adults are female. Next. And so the question becomes, can gender ride the aging train? So if we look at the 624 respondents to the 2014 Planning for Women in Aging survey, we see that 55% said their comprehensive plans address the needs of aging, but only 2% said their plans address the needs of women. Similarly, about 53% said they consider how their work affects different ages, but only 17% considered gender. And so what we're wondering is if those who address the needs of aging might also show more attention to the needs of gender. Next. Well, it's improved a little bit, but not much. With the 2019 survey, still only about half of the responding communities said that their comprehensive plan addressed the needs of seniors. And we were up to 12% that said they addressed the needs of women. This is up from 2% in 2014. When we look across types of plans, we see that emergency plans are most likely to address the needs of women, but still only a third of them do. We see that transportation plans are most likely to address the needs of seniors. 69% say they do, but only a quarter say they address the needs of women. And economic development plans are least likely to address the needs of seniors, women, or children. As someone who works in economic development planning, I'm particularly embarrassed by this result and want to see what we might do next. So my students last spring looked at those 12% of communities that said their plans were addressing the needs of women, and they pulled the ones they could find off the web, which was 80, and they read them all. And then they used a computer technique called natural language processing to look for words that might address women. And they found not that many that addressed women. So then they looked for other identities that might relate to women, like family, parenting, children, teen, youth, senior, age-friendly. And then they also looked at poverty, vulnerable, race, LGBTQ, etc. And then they looked at the various plan elements, whether it was housing, land use, transportation, public space, service, social engagement, and economic development. And the APA Women in Planning Division helped think about this, and Andy and Marissa also served as consultants to this project. Next. So when you look to the left, you see the most frequently mentioned planning elements were services, public space, and social engagement. And that is where we saw the greatest attention to words that related to gender, women, female, but still it was only 5 to 6%, that deep orange in the bar chart to the right. Where you see more attention given is in housing and land use, and you see the yellow bar references family and parenting, but this is mostly dealing with single family housing, which plans have a lot to say about, but it's not clear at all that single family housing is terribly helpful to issues of advancing gender equity in planning. Next. So what do the plans say? Well, number one, they're rarely mentioned. And when they are mentioned, it tends to be in the demographics section, the demographics of your community, or in the acknowledgement sections, thanking those who participated. Planning tries to be gender neutral, but gender blind is not neutral at all. It's gender blind. And other thing that was interesting is that most plans were out of date, 10 years out of date, 15 years old, and don't even mention concepts like mobility, trip chaining, or care work. So part of this inattention to gender issues could just be because many of the comprehensive plans are old. We also found, as we know, safety is a really big issue for women, but it's generally not mentioned in plans. And so while women's needs might be partially addressed through an aging or a family focus, the question we ask is, when do women get their own car on this train? Next. So how do we get to change? Well, this is when we did the focus groups back in 2014, people in the focus group said very clearly, okay, it's one thing to talk about how we deal with gender in our planning practice, but we also want to talk about gender dynamics in our planning workplaces. And so we did a second survey in 2015, and 327 planners responded, and the Women in Planning, the Private Practice Division, Small Town and Rural, Housing and Community Development all helped to advertise the survey. You can see a full report on this survey in the article that Marissa and I wrote for the Journal of the American Planning Association. Next. So what factors influence planning workplace culture? This issue is of keen interest to planners. When Andy, who's standing there at the podium at the APA conference, presented on this, she presented to a packed house. I'm glad the fire department didn't show up because we had more people in the room than were probably legal to be there. So this is something planners care a lot about. And what we looked at in this research was 5 characteristics: gender respect, exclusive communication or mansplaining, work-life benefits, the perception that you can actually take advantage of flexibility in work life, and equal opportunities in the workplace. Next. So what we see is that gender issues are heard, but women are not. So we see that gender issues are easy to raise, gender equality is taken seriously, my supervisors respect my decisions, and so do my coworkers. However, men are still heard more than women, and I, and most of the respondents were female, must be more prepared than coworkers of the other gender. So mansplaining is still the norm. Next. With regard to work-life benefits and flexibility, we do a little better. People's commitment to the workplace is questioned less than half the time if you're taking advantage of work-life flexible benefits. People felt like they had the flexibility to manage their work and carrying responsibilities. And what we have to point out is this data is before the explosion in online working arrangements that occurred during COVID. So I'm sure that these results would be even better now with us as a society getting more used to the notion of flexibility in time and place of work. Next. With regard to equal opportunity, the majority agree that they have equal opportunities for advancement, regardless of gender, but only 2/3 believe that men and women are paid the same. So there's a lot of work needing to go still on pay equity. Next. So does female management matter? Yes, it does. If you look at the last 4 sets of columns in this table, you'll see that the light blue is respondents and planning offices with female management. And here they report that gender equality concerns are more likely to be taken seriously, flex time is more encouraged, equal pay is more commonly reported, as well as equal opportunities for advancement. So female management matters. The one place where it doesn't matter is with regard to mansplaining. Men heard more in professional meetings. Having a female manager does not help address that problem. Next. So we need to push paradigms and change professional practice. And as one respondent said, I know it's a basic premise, but I can't overstate how important it is to have women in leadership and men who recognize the importance and value of gender diversity. Next. This is a list of where you can find publications that reference these things, and these PowerPoints will be up later on the website, and you can click on these links. But now I would like to turn it over to Andy.
Good morning. I'm Andy Miklo, and I'm going to present a portion of my research which looked at the status of women as a subject and object of planning. And so today I'm going to talk about what I've kind of termed pink line planning.
Oop, I think you muted yourself somehow, Andy.
Cool.
There you
That's
are.
really good.
Welcome
Yeah.
back.
Great.
Welcome back.
So I'm not sure where I did that. I'll start back at the beginning of the definition of pink lining. So I use pink lining to refer to the gender division of space through mechanisms like land use regulations, comprehensive planning, and suburbanization. And as Mildred's presentation just included a discussion of comprehensive planning, I'm not really going to talk about that, but I'll just kind of note that comprehensive planning is a pervasive and very powerful tool for guiding land use regulation in a community, and integral, if it's what should be integral to a comprehensive planning process, is participation. And in the context of this conversation, particularly women's participation and the time of the engagement opportunity, the provision of childcare, and all of these types of things impact women's ability to participate in a planning process. I'd like to begin today with the concept really quickly of separate spheres. The concept of separate spheres is central to this theory of pink lining. Separate sphere dichotomies like public and private, male and female, knowledge and experience, workplace and residence, and urban and suburban are foundational to planning. Within a pink line environment, the division between public and private underlies all of these others. The public domain is typically associated with men, knowledge, work, and the urban. And then the private becomes associated with women, experience, residence, and the suburb. And this connection with the private sphere leads to women's exclusion from political and planning processes. Pink lining in planning is based on a system of beliefs about the role of women and men in society. Traditional land use regulations enforce a particular type of gender, sexual, and family identity that is more in line with the ideals of the early 1900s rather than what is in line with what is now. This is problematic for any person who lives outside this paradigmatic post-white, post-war nuclear family. For example, women who work, same-sex and queer families, and people of color. And we can see just how far back this goes if we look about 100 years at the California Supreme Court's decision in Miller versus the Board of Public Works in the city of Los Angeles. This case justified residential zoning on the grounds that it protected the civic and social value of the American home. The court found that the character and quality of manhood and womanhood are in large measure the result of the home environment. And so this court's decision affirmed that it is a legitimate state interest to promote and protect heterosexual families and persons. The US Supreme Court referenced the Miller decision in the Euclid versus Ambler Realty decision, and I'm sure that most, if not all of us, are familiar with the role of Euclid in planning. And with the construction boom in the post-war period that then entrenched this form of zoning into the landscape and resulting in the sprawling pink line development that characterizes metropolitan America. During this time, we also see that zoning ordinances began to move away from the term single housekeeping unit to more restrictive zoning ordinances that define family in terms of the relationship between household members. Many ordinances explicitly required household members to be related by blood, marriage, or adoption. Some localities have moved away from restrictive single-family definitions by incorporating functional family reforms into their zoning ordinances. And many of these appear to be allow for flexibility in living arrangements, but many of these ordinances actually judge the value of the relationship by how closely it resembles a traditional nuclear family. And so traditional or these Euclidean zoning ordinances have both created an idea and reinforced this idea of family that has literally been built into the landscape. And using family definitions as a form of land use regulation reinforces traditional gender roles and family structures that disadvantage women and those living outside of the traditional family structure. Marshall Ritzdorf wrote, an implicit meaning of the word family embedded in married suburban bliss has shaped much of the municipal land use agenda. Built into the exclusive single-family residential zoning district is the assumption that a parent, almost always the mother, will be at home all day to take care of her children. The built environment reflects a stereotypically male bias designed to facilitate the role of as men as wage earners and women as homemakers. And our traditional zoning ordinances exhibit control over the lives of women, men, and in their families by regulating the location of jobs, services, and as well as household composition. Turning just a second to talk about some of the effects of pink lining. The effects of pink lining include women's isolation and confinement, limited employment opportunities, and more complex travel patterns compared to men. The 1950s and 60s bedroom suburbs led to women's isolation in the post-war period, and then post-war women's isolation turned into confinement as women started to enter the workforce in the 1970s. Women are constrained by the inadequacies of the physical environment, physical design of the suburban residential environment, which was planned and built to facilitate the private role of women within the nuclear family. And this segregated land use pattern, which still characterizes much of our metropolitan areas, discourages extended family or community sharing of housework and replaces a lot of our public play spaces with private parks or private yards. So just as an illustration of what this looks like, so women face, especially suburban women, face not just like a double burden, which is the responsibility for home and childcare in addition to their paid jobs that they perform, but they also face what we're calling a triple burden due to the segregation of uses, auto dependence, and the prevalence of single family homes in many of our neighborhoods. The land use patterns of a community impact a woman's opportunities and the size of the area to which she has access. Moreover, the division of services and workplace from residents also results in more complex travel patterns for women. We kind of call this trip chaining. So you end up going from childcare to the shopping to your work. And we see that women and men actually have different travel patterns, especially in commuting, where men's travel patterns are typically from point A to point B, and women, as I said, demonstrate more complex travel patterns. And this is a direct result of the antiquated and value-laden assumptions underlying the American zoning and planning paradigm, and are literally ingrained in our suburban landscape in our American consciousness. And clearly, the gendered assumptions that underpin traditional land use regulations have significant implications for women, especially as household employment patterns change and continue to change. As long as the nuclear family remains an implicit assumption in the American zoning and planning paradigm, household production will continue to be women's responsibility, and the pink line landscape will impact her travel patterns, job opportunities, and care duties. And so what does it look like to plan for women? A lot of these things might seem quite obvious, but the American planning paradigm has been working for almost 100 years to pink line women, and it's time that we started planning for them. Broadly, planning for women falls into the categories of participation in comprehensive planning, land use reform, housing reform, and expanding transportation options. So this looks like using inclusive mixed methods for planning. So this kind of refers to what I was talking about at the beginning, about methods of engagement in comprehensive planning and the role that comprehensive plans have implicitly to our land use regulations, focusing on moving between outreach to this level of engagement. Continuing to rethink zoning and land use regulation. As I noted, that a lot of communities are moving away from traditional ordinances with form-based codes. We start to see a lot of communities removing single-family zoning ordinances. And so it's really, it's continuing to rethink these types of things in the way that we regulate our land use in our communities. As Ramona noted, I believe that women have different needs when it comes to housing options that are more vulnerable to issues like displacement and are more likely to be heads of household and for single family. So expanding housing options and increased affordability and accessible to transit and employment are particularly important for women. And expanding transportation options to address accessibility and trip training is another example of how a person in a community can plan for women. Thank you. And with this, I will turn over to Marissa.
Hello. Just getting my screen fitted. All right. Hello. So I'm going to talk with you all about aging in queer place. I queer the literature on urban planning for aging by centering the lives of older lesbians in Los Angeles County. This really contributes to our understanding of loneliness in the city as one ages, considering loneliness is really the greatest predictor of poor health and quality of life for older LGBTQ adults. I do want to preface this by saying I am working on a new title for this chapter. So if you have any ideas as you listen, please feel free to pass them along. I have my email here and also throughout the presentation. All right, so I first want to define loneliness. I use Olivia Lang's definition in her book, The Lonely City. Loneliness is a desire for closeness, for joining up, joining in, joining together, for gathering what has otherwise been sundered, abandoned, broken, or left in isolation. Loneliness is a longing for integration, for a sense of feeling whole. It's an emotion that's really laden with a lot of shame in our society, making it really difficult to study. So very little research has been done on loneliness. And regardless of how many close connections you have, it's really about whether those connections meet your expectations for intimacy. So cities can be really lonely places for everyone, whether you're in an apartment or alone or amid a crowd of 1,000 people. And capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, settler colonialism, these structures are all loneliness-making projects that can really destroy communities. Now, I've included a picture of the cover of Radcliffe Hall's book, The Well of Loneliness, because that was actually the first book ever written published in the US about lesbians. And from that title alone, The Well of Loneliness, we can see that lesbians have been coded as lonely since they've first been written into the world. So I figured who better to talk to about navigating loneliness, something that everyone experiences, but who better to talk about it than lesbians. So early interviews kept coming back to the importance. Oh, next. Sorry, Andy. I am not saying next. Thank you for keeping up. Appreciate it. Early interviews kept coming back to the importance of home as very empowering, but also very lonely. So the way that I'm looking at loneliness is by mapping this layer of queer homemaking, which is all about disrupting and transforming heteronormative practices in the home, which can be as simple as flying a rainbow flag, onto frameworks for aging in place, which are all about attachments to a particular home neighborhood, and home community. I'll be focusing on the house in this particular presentation. So participants use different uses of the house, fostered or challenged older lesbians' health and safety through experiences of loneliness in the face of ageism, homophobia, and patriarchy. Next. So my research questions are informed by these early interviews. I asked, does aging shape lesbians' homemaking practices? Does lesbian identity affect aging in place? Is a house a sanctuary, an escape, or a trap for lesbians as they age? Spoiler, it's all of the above. Next. So to understand these questions, I recorded 29 oral histories with older lesbians around Los Angeles County. You can see the demographic information here. I use a snowball method to meet folks and conduct these interviews around place attachments today, in the past, and into the future. And I use pseudonyms for the rest of the presentation. I do want to note there's going to be a clear difference between younger generations of lesbians for whom home ownership rates are really much lower than what you can see here. Only 7 of the 29 are renters. And furthermore, I mean, historically, you know, home ownership has been very fraught for women generally, especially women who are not attached to a man to purchase the home, so lesbians in particular. So next. And then I also just mapped out the residents of the participants, and you can see how dispersed they are throughout Los Angeles County. And just to get some bearings, well, actually, yeah. So I want to note that the dispersal is also really reflective of why I chose Los Angeles County as an extended case site. This large size and sprawling scope of Los Angeles is more representative of non-urban places around the US versus the concentrated enclaves that are typically studied as gay meccas, like we think of the East Village in New York or the Castro in San Francisco, and those aren't really as representative of these spaces across the United States where LGBTQ folks are flourishing. Next. So for some, the house is a physical anchor in the sprawling landscape of Los Angeles. Laura, who we'll hear from first, used to drive all over LA for work, and then after she retired, she refused to drive more than 15 miles from her house. Next. Laura explained, so I like to stay in my area because I know the streets. I don't have to get on the freeway to get to Glendale. Now that I'm in my late 60s, I don't need to put in that work. I've done it before. I'll wait until these events are in my radius. So the freeways for Laura are this isolating factor. For others, living by the freeways are actually really important for accessing activities in LA that kind of kept us vibrant, as they said. But this is how Laura is making do. And so instead she goes to the local Pasadena Senior Center, but going to the center still leaves her with this longing for connection, this loneliness kind of from other lesbians, especially other older Black lesbians who don't go to that center. Next. The house was also an anchor for psychological and emotional safety for participants. This was true for many participants. Sam, who we'll hear from next, used her best friend's house to help her cope with the loss of loved ones. Next. Sam explains, my mother transitioned and people close to me have transitioned. For me, it's a healing space. So it's really common for participants to talk about the importance of the house as this healing space, as this sanctuary to cope with grief from the loss of family and friends. Mortality is really a lonely experience, and loss is considered to be this cousin of loneliness. So using the private house as this sacred space seemed particularly important for Black lesbians, for the Black participants in the study, and this might be reflective of the homophobia that's been studied and found in Black churches, and also compounded with the anti-Blackness that's been studied a lot in LGBTQ places, particularly LGBTQ places of worship. Next. So not all the attachments to the houses were positive. This year, Jackie, who we'll hear from next, contracted a staph infection and suffered a near-death experience such that she's still relearning to walk. Because of her illness and aging, she started fearing her house. Next. Jackie explains, I just didn't want to be alone with me. I need physical help. I just didn't feel safe kind of with my own thoughts, with my feelings. And, you know, I'm not very functional. I feel very vulnerable. Apparently it's part of the journey, but it just doesn't feel good. I feel like I'm broken. So Jackie had loved her alone time in what she called her happy house before she got sick, but these new vulnerabilities in her aging body made her feel unsafe in her own house. And so this makes us wonder, you know, how might cities and neighborhoods make care services more accessible so that people like Jackie can feel safe in her house and thus in her own body as she ages. Furthermore, how can these care services also be particularly inclusive and not kind of drenched in what participants kind of described as some homophobia, and also inaccessibility in terms of affordability. Next. The house is also a critical site for one's not only personal safety, but also communal. So the final theme that we'll talk about is the house as a communal anchor. Jo, who has a small group of older lesbians over to her house every week to play cards, explains next. It's a safe place, or house is a safe place to meet. There aren't any other places. We don't go to the bars, that's old. We don't go out late like that now. So Jo's describing, especially when safe public and commercial space is limited, the house can be this critical site for identity and community development. Next. Participants really highlighted their attachments to the house in a way that I see as central to this queer world-making endeavor. So these women are thinking ahead. Co-housing came up every time one group of older Black lesbians got together. Another participant said that senior housing would be much more appealing if she and her friends could actually apply as a cohort so that they could maintain the friendships that they've spent decades cultivating. But I think also questions still remain about how lifestyle communities like senior housing, how they can look if they're not so entrenched in anti-Blackness and heteronormativity, as well as the care services themselves, so that the house does not feel like a trap, as it did for Jackie, for instance, and can remain this kind of space of sanctuary for someone like Sam, and are actually inclusive and truly affordable. So I will next end there, and this is just a review of the literature on older LGBTQ adults that I published in Journal of Planning Literature recently. And I do want to just note that the painting in the slide background is done by a lesbian artist in Los Angeles, Karen Wallen, so I want to make sure to give that attribution. And again, I'm Marissa Tereski, and thanks a lot.
Okay. Was that everybody? I think that was. We flew through this. Let's go into some Q&A. Folks, if anyone has questions, feel free to post them into the questions box and we will get to those. Let me get my webcam back on. Here we go. I think this first question, I think I want to say that it should go to Mildred, but I could be wrong. Why is inequity considered from an intersectional identity lens versus treating each identity as a separate item? Intersectional identity is often ignored in most planning research.
Absolutely, an intersectional lens is needed, and I think Marissa and Andy can also speak to this quite well. What the students were doing was trying to take a they wanted to practice what machine learning could show them, and it's looking for words and the text that surrounds those words. And so we'll have to go back and look and see if the word intersectional or intersectionality is ever used in any comprehensive plan. My guess is it will appear even less frequently than words like women. But absolutely, it's the intersectionality of all this that makes it so critically important that we look at all these dimensions if we want to promote equity.
Anyone else have comments on that?
Yeah, I can jump in. I actually propose in my JPL article kind of intersectional approach to aging, aging plans on aging, and what would it look like if we kind of mapped fair housing laws onto what I call fair aging laws, right? What would that look like to have a fair aging law and framework? And what I found, I mean, in my own research is just how critically important the house is, and the private house, which, you know, has been talked about as especially the single family house. I mean, Mildred mentioned this being a site of patriarchy and heteronormativity, and Andy talks about this too. And still, in the absence of commercial and public space that's safe, we've seen how Black lesbians for a long, long time have found havens, especially in the house, right? And communities of color have long found that to be true. And so I also found that older, as folks age, lesbians find this refuge and this sanctuary in the house. And so what might that look like? I think that's kind of how I'm applying intersectionality implicitly, right, to thinking about queer urban planning. What would that look like? You know, how does that manifest in affordable and accessible housing, in care services? And so thinking about the policy issue and then thinking about how that actually is a manifestation of kind of intersectional equity. And in this case, in terms of overlapping gender, sexual orientation, and age onto that. But we can do it in so many ways. And I mean, I have a lot of ideas and examples about that. So I'm happy to talk with folks about that offline as well more. But that's an incredibly important thing, I think, to planning now, should have been in the past, and continues to be going forward.
I want to bring us down a couple levels just because this is a great webinar and I think it's really important, but I want to I've been hearing a lot of words, and while as I might know them, people on our call might not, and so they might be hearing you use these words and not really understand what they mean. So if we could talk a little bit about patriarchy and heteronormativity and some of the other kind of buzzwords, I guess, that you're using, what might be considered buzzwords to some people, or words that they just don't even know what they mean. But we're using them, and I just want to make sure that everyone on the call understands what they mean and the context that you're putting them in. Anyone want to take that on?
I think Marissa should do it.
I was gonna throw Andy under the bus, and then I said, no, that's too mean.
Yeah.
Andy. I would say, I mean, I think Andy's presentation did describe heteronorm. Thanks for bringing us back to the definitions, Christine. Yeah, that's really important, because I do think that, yeah, I mean, that is, it should be part of the, you know, planning canon, and, you know, right from the get-go and intro to planning, but we don't talk about it that much. And so I think, you know, heteronormativity is, Andy described really well, the implicit assumption that viewing the world and living as a heterosexual person and living heterosexually in the world is the normal thing, and kind of the preference in the world. So a great example is that people who aren't heterosexual have to come out, right, and have to disclose that, and it's something to even disclose. Well, why don't straight people have to disclose that they're straight, right? Because that's the implicit assumption that you're straight until proven not. And I think in planning androcentric, what Andy describes as androcentric, please also folks chime in. You know, I don't have these definitions pulled up, so pardon my kind of longer elaboration on this, but I think androcentric planning can be seen in a similar light, that planning is done for centers, it literally means centers, males, and so prioritizes kind of plans for men, as Mildred describes, that's the assumption in plans. People aren't assuming planning for women, they assume everyone's a man unless there's some specific thing about women, as opposed to why aren't we planning just for women and gender minorities from the baseline?
So I'll put this in because years ago, back in 2008, we did a survey with the National Planning Association, and we used a heteronormative name. We called it family-friendly planning. And that came from a series of focus groups we had held the year before at the National Planning Conference, where we were trying to put children and family issues, other than just a narrow definition of single family housing. We were trying to put children's issues more into the planning debate. And even addressing children and family friendly issues in a broader way than just single family housing was kind of on the edge of what planning was willing to address. So even though we can look back on that now and say, well, the use of the term was heteronormative, in those focus groups, people were talking about how dangerous it was to put children's issues at the forefront for planning. how marginal, how revolutionary, for crying out loud, how revolutionary that was. So, looking back now, it's like, oh, why did we use those terms? But at the time, even talking about children was, the last day of the conference at an offsite hotel because the issue just wasn't central. And so what's happening now, getting back to this question of intersectionality, what's happening now is there's a lot of interest in aging, but it's interest in aging in a very traditional way. And what we want to do is use this newfound interest in aging to broaden the lens of how planners look at things, to think about everyone across all ages in a much broader way. And that aging almost opens people's eyes to the legitimacy of looking at people beyond an androcentric, everybody's a man, everybody's a working age, able-bodied man. That's who we plan for, right? No, we plan for everybody. And when you put aging into it, then you have to start thinking about all the different bodies out there and what their planning needs are. And it really explodes the imagination. But if you only keep it in the narrow age-friendly is, then you're not exploding the imagination and you're missing the opportunity of this moment.
And, Mildred, I think that there might be, a lot of planners that have an understanding of this to kind of look further out than, your traditional aging person. But they end up going to their communities when a project comes in. And, right now, 55 and better communities are the hot item in development right now, at least here in Ohio, for sure. And I can tell you that all of these, cute little cookie cutter units are all starting in like the low 300,000s, and you're not going to find a rental unit. You're not going to find, any kind of affordable housing in these huge new developments that are coming through. But if you should, as a planner, suggest anything other, the community will immediately aghast, like, we don't want any affordable housing. We don't want rental units. Are you kidding? So I guess, to give credit to a lot of planners where, it's on their mind, they understand it, but they can't fight the system that exists. How do they kind of break through and get people thinking, outside of their comfort zone, outside of the box, and to really look at what is actually in front of them and who their fellow community members really are?
So there's so much there. Number one, baby boomers don't want to live in age segregated communities. And so building all these over 55 communities, I don't want to live in them. Ramona doesn't want to live in them. And
I can tell you now, in 50 years, I'm not going to want to live in one.
So why is it that we legally allow age discrimination in housing for older adults? It's just wrong. It's time to change. And it's time to think in new modalities of multi-generational housing, because these age 55 and older, that's not the way to go. But let me give an example. Let's think of accessory dwelling units, right? They originally came out as the idea of granny flats. Your mother lives in your backyard. But smart planners write those ADU, accessory dwelling units, to not require a familial connection. Don't write that into your rules. It's just an accessory dwelling unit. And do not require that the owner live in the big house. The owner might live in the accessory dwelling unit. And that opens up all sorts of possibilities for promoting affordable housing and different kinds of housing units. For example, I move into the garage apartment and a young Hispanic family moves into the big house because they have a lot of kids. And maybe they can't afford the rent level, so I reduce the rent level and they provide me some help with groceries or getting to doctor's appointments. There's all sorts of possibilities we could imagine, but let's not write our codes so restrictively. Let's write them a little bit more open. And if you look at the ADU recommended stuff, and Ramona, I think you see a lot of this when in other presentations where we've had the folks from Portland on, write them in a way that allows a broader a broader use of those codes to build, because yeah, the NIMBYs are going to come out. That is true. But we as planners can think about how we write the codes.
Thank you. This is a very specific question, but I too had this question for Marissa. So you're, we're talking, you were talking about older female lesbians. What, define older?
Good question. 65 to 80 was the age range.
65 to 80. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, next question. Oh, this is good. So do you have any sense of how the studies done in the LA area could help reach conclusions in other areas of the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. I was actually just thinking about this as Mildred was talking. I mean, I think housing affordability generally, right, is something that's a huge crisis in LA, and it's a huge crisis across the country, globally, right? So I think kind of jumping off of Mildred's, what Mildred is talking about here, some of the participants, I didn't talk about it in the presentation, but they were like, they did the math, and it was either they stay in their house after their spouse had died, let's say, and they didn't have any kids, and they had a 3-bedroom single family house. It was more financially affordable for them to stay there than do anything else. Besides, their only other option was move to a mobile home park that was 2 hours outside of Los Angeles, the city of LA, right? And that's a huge problem, right? Why is that the case? And how are our policies, how are our zoning codes, as Mildred was talking about, kind of fostering that inaffordability when people, aren't willing to move, it sounds like, and there's very little information that we have about why people decide to age in place or move elsewhere, right? And I think people, at least my findings are such that people want to stay in their home communities. That network is really critical, especially for historically underserved communities, right? Finding those connections to people that they trust, and those friendships, and what I would call, queer kinship, right? This queer family almost. It's so important to be able to stay near those folks for people, and they don't want to move. And so how can we make sure that people can find housing that's more realistic for their needs, right? Maybe going into an ADU and not staying in the single family house. And then that house opens up for, younger folks, as Mildred was saying, who do need that space. And so there's this, there's this huge crisis of space in all of our cities, and so how can we make sure that we're optimizing the housing that we already have? And aging is a really big part of that people who are older, are taking up these larger homes in a lot of cases, and not for nothing, right? It is the most affordable way that they're able to continue having this safe kind of shelter and sanctuary. So I think that's a big question, but I'll leave it there.
You mentioned something that made me want to ask another question. You mentioned mobile home parks, and I actually I happened to have read an article just this past weekend about how mobile, if you have like a spare couple $1 million and you're looking to invest, apparently mobile home parks is becoming a popular ticket item, particularly, I guess, in the Midwest, because it's quick money, and the majority of those people are renters. But I guess my question is there something to this? Because they are smaller communities, they can be tight-knit communities, they can be affordable. There's this whole movement of tiny houses and people building shipping container homes, and just the whole concept of downsizing. And is there something to this?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I was going to do a comparative, and maybe this is, in a couple of years. There's a whole lesbian mobile home park in Arizona, I think, for only 55 plus lesbians. And land has always been really important to lesbians, and finding safe land, right? That these festivals have always been on outside of kind of the central city where people aren't intruding and people can feel safe. There's an incredible study Esther Sullivan, I think, did called I'm just looking at it now to make sure to get the title right, called Manufacturing Insecurity on mobile home parks. And it's more actually from the way that mobile home parks are so exploitative, especially because they they do just can like upcharge these rents at exorbitant, rates, particularly for communities of color, immigrant communities, and it's a huge problem. And they're kind of off the map in a lot of cases, and there aren't like a ton of regulations around it, and so it can be really problematic. But on the outset, right, it can seem like so great and that you kind of have your own space. And so I think there's like some caution there, right? And then the other question in terms of loneliness, right, that they're off the grid, right? They're pretty far away. And there was another participant I had who went into the desert because it was the most affordable place. It's 2 hours away, and she spends, every week driving 2 hours to meet friends for lunch in Los Angeles. And so then we have an environmental crisis here too, of driving all that way multiple times just to maintain your community, and how hard that is as you age and can't, it gets harder to drive at night, and what does that mean for safety? So I think, mobile home parks are really hot. There's a lot left to research there, and maybe I'll have more to say in the coming years.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to Ramona, who I know has a couple of good questions. So this one is, are there any comp plans that you could provide as good examples that illustrate some of these ideas of incorporating equity?
Yes.
Mildred, from those 80-some comp plans that your students took a look at?
Yes, they did. They found some good ones, and they have an issue brief, and I should, they have an issue brief that's up on my website where they actually link to some of these plans as a case study. I don't know if there's a way for us I can dig that up and put it in the chat, if that would go to everybody.
Yeah, and if it doesn't, I can copy it and paste it in the chat so that everyone can't get it. So if you wouldn't mind doing that. Okay.
For questions.
Okay. Ramona, would you like to step in and ask a couple questions?
Yeah, I'm kind of, so where does the movement begin in regards to really adjusting to the issues that we've all talked about, especially in regard to the inclusiveness of planning? And do we see that change occurring in planning, schools, and curriculum that broadens the mindset in which we normally have addressed planning from the traditional, more narrow perspective that which we know in hindsight has been more impactful to our communities as it's evolved and is not really kept up? And is it the planning practice that will influence the development of that in terms of a more cultural, deep embedding in the planning culture itself? Or is it the other way around, and it's a combination? And is APA as an organization more like the hub to really start galvanizing these types of discussions and movement? Because you know that there's a lot of planners who feel that they don't lead, right? Because there's elected officials and we serve and all that sort of stuff. And that has been acceptable thus far, but it no longer is. So how does this group imagine that? And I think, Mildred, you've always been in that hotbed in regards to, I think, which is why I really like our partnership, is the way you work and the kind of brilliant young people that you bring together and that lens. So what do you think?
Well, I'll say a little bit, and then I want to turn it over to Andy, because she's a practicing planner on this panel and she lives this stuff every day. But one of the things that we discovered when we did that survey back in 2008 about families is that planners who led with comprehensive planning that put family friendly, again, that heteronormative word, sorry, but put that in, were actually not places that had zoning and building codes and outcomes that were more family friendly. Suburbs say they are, but are they really? And Andy has a whole article on this about suburbs. But what we discovered is that you just quietly go do the work. You write the codes, you rewrite the codes. Andy talked about form-based zoning. I mean, you rewrite the codes and you don't need to tell everybody in the world about it. Just go do it, because when you broadcast what you're doing through a comprehensive planning process or whatever, the NIMBYs come out and there's a lot of resistance to change and you don't get to go anywhere. So it's almost like you make the road by walking. You walk the talk and then talk the talk later, after people have gotten used to seeing the walking, which is a real flip in how we normally think about things. Oh, let's get everybody conscious about this issue and then moving forward. You might be able to do that in the classroom, but I'm not sure that you do that in the community. I think in the community, you might act first and then let the ideas evolve over time. But Andy, I really want to turn this to you, because you are in the planning practice world, and you've also been a very critical scholar as well.
You're in the trenches.
Thank you, Mildred. Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts on this. Two, they're very separate. I think the first one I want to talk about is somebody, I'm in a very interesting age where I went to school kind of in for my master's degree at one time, and then I worked for a little bit, and then I got my PhD at another time, and I was able to kind of see this shift in like planning literature in what was focused on in my planning school and what was taught during so at Cornell, what was taught in the master's program. And I really started to see a shift in what was being taught to planners. And when I taught an intro to planning class as well, I think, especially when I picked that up from the other professor, there was continued iterations of trying to advance new things in the way we kind of approach our communities. But what I'm seeing kind of in practice is that there's an actual tension between people that have been in the field for a really long time. And those people tend to be, you know, the division heads, the department directors, and they have a way that they've gotten to their place that they are, right? And those decisions that they've made, which younger scholars now or younger planners might see as not like problematic, but have been taught that, you know, maybe there's consequences to the way, or like that maybe racist zoning might be racist, you know, crazy idea here. But like there's a real pushback, and I think that there's a tension between people that are in decision making and the staff that have the newer education. And so kind of where APA, I think there's a really good idea and a way to do this is like through continuing education. But sometimes, and like I love this session for this, is because I think this ideas, they're new ideas, right? Sometimes when you go to like an APA conference, we're all just patting ourselves on the back of like, we're doing the same thing. Great, ADUs are wonderful, but like, what are we going to do that's different? And I think trying to give a space in planning to these younger people that have great ideas, just because they haven't been there before doesn't mean they're not gonna work. Right. And like, I think that's something that I wish I could tell people in power, but like they're in power. So I'm not entirely sure like how to get that. So I see a really real tension, and I think it speaks to like this practice and this education. But I also think that things are changing, and I hate to say that, but like, right, like bureaucracies are slow, governments are slow. But then that also creates this other tension of like people's lives are really happening. So like, you know, I really see that. But in terms of a practicing planner, I have a really unique role. So I'm a policy analyst for a county council. And so what that means, I'm actually a nonpartisan policy analyst. And so what I do is I analyze the code after it comes over from the executive, or the comprehensive plan after it comes over. And my job is to ask, like, why did you do this? Did you think about this? Who did you engage? And then another component is that I provide our elected officials with information when they're like making decisions. And so I think one of the things that I'm able to do, and I think other planners are very familiar with, we can kind of select the information that we give to our electeds. And I think trying to balance this role of staff as being like, right, we are professionals with an opinion, but we still have to defer to electeds, again, is this real tension that we're all trying to work towards. So I think I pointed to a lot of tensions, but I do think there's a lot of choice and I think a lot of potential to answer that. I think continuing education especially is super important in ways like this, like I said, that are innovative sessions that aren't just patting each other on the back about like, look at what, and I work in Seattle, look at what Seattle did. That's great, but like, Seattle's really not that great. And I think that's, sorry, I hate to say that. I worked on the East Coast for a really long time and we always look to like the West Coast about like, what's the West Coast doing? And I get out here and I'm like, we're not even that great. And so I think that it's like really interesting. And so I think it's really also just like pushing for what you believe as a planner. Like we're experts, we went to school, we know our communities. And sometimes if we have good electeds, they listen to us sometimes.
I think that that's a challenging job that you have, and I think that that's terrific, Andy. And I think more people, it'd be great to hear back from this audience as to what they are attendees, as to what they are seeing in their communities and what they would like to do in terms of lifting up best practices. Because the equity issue, as we have all discovered and continue to discover, is never going to go away, right? It's almost like eating on the edge of the pizza. It's really hard to get to that inner part of the pizza and to really be able to digest it because it's so large and there's so many different layers of embedded, well, it could be viewed as biases, but it is in the sense that when you take a look at this discussion and you take a look at how you point out those, for example, those traditional norms that we've accepted, which is partly human nature, I would imagine, because we don't question. It's really trying to find that trigger, that lever, that would trigger a whole bunch of different things that would address the systemic. And I think that that's one of the things that we as planners may forget is really embracing that this is systemic. And it's not necessarily that easy where you say, oh, this is the solution, but it is how does that trigger? How does that impact? And are there some questions that we should be asking ourselves every time that we have come up with a planning solution for equity?
So, I've been with the American Rescue Plan, there was this opportunity for communities to do something different, do something transformational is what they were asking for. And equity was certainly on people's agenda, especially after the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera. And we've been looking for ways in which communities might take this little bit of extra money and do something more equitable. And we're not finding as much as we'd like to see. Yeah. But when you think about equity, you can think about it as redistribution. You can think about it as procedural, involving more people in the conversation. But if you just stop there, you haven't gone far enough. You also need to think about conceptual paradigm change. And that's the part that I think is what stymies us. It's where you may have this conversation in particular communities, you might have it in the academic community, but getting that legitimized in practice is a real challenge. So we looked, for example, at in that national survey, a lot of the respondents were women. And yet we didn't see that having a woman city manager really made a difference, unlike what we found, Marissa, with a woman planning manager. And we were like, why is that? Well, they tended to be in the smaller and more rural communities. They maybe didn't have that much power actually, and weren't that familiar with what the new paradigms are. Like the students were so surprised when they read these 80 plans and nobody was talking about trip chaining. It's like, hello? Why is that, which isn't that new, not shown in these plans? And then they said, well, plans aren't updated all that often. And so the plans are out of date. But so paradigm change is what we need. Paradigm change requires a conversation. It requires imagination. And it requires a need to really switch things up and do it differently. And there's a lot of pressures that have to come to play for that to happen. But Ramona, you're talking about a paradigm change in Hawaii with this more holistic approach. Your whole presentation here at the beginning of the talk, how real is it? It was pretty exciting to me to listen to. And is that really encouraging a shift in the way policymakers think and act.
Well, all planning is local. God, who said that? And so the context in which we find ourselves in Hawaii, right? It's not like when Andy says that, you know, Seattle is not really I mean, she's about as far west in the continent as she can get. So the next big part would be Hawaii. And so the cultural context in which is what my presentation is based on, is really important, because there's culture everywhere. Every community has its own culture, whether it's actually race driven, you know, and that kind of recognition, understanding, and outreach, that vulnerability as well as sensitivity to, is really critical. But I do think that in our community, what the Department of Human Services has done is really earth-shaking. And by the very nature that they've embedded that sustainability as law, as we know, the transformational institutional listen, I work for the federal government, so transformational change is really more driven, let's face it, by politics, right? A change in administration, new priorities, all that sort of stuff. So the context in which we find ourselves really drives our solutions, which I find really challenging and interesting, especially when you talked about ARPA, because could that transformation have been limited because there's the compliance issues if you're using federal money? I mean, I hear that at the local and the, you know, the state government. A lot of people are, first of all, when a program gets rolled out, there's always rules that, you know, this is where we are, and then the federal government needs to address other things that come up. And so, you know, I can understand that local government and state government who are receiving funding will be super careful because they don't know where the next shoe to drop. And as we've heard a lot of comments about the federal government, nobody really wants that type of compliance issues to come out. So at the same time, we see for the private sector a lot of push towards, here are some technological tools, here's some new lens, new programs that can help you do your job better, faster, and all that sort of stuff. At what point in time is that really being driven by local leadership? And how is it really limited by the political situation in which we find ourselves? So like, for example, when you talk about Hawaii, if you didn't embed that as law, I mean, you know, this year, everybody in the legislature was up, everybody was up for re-election. So that kind of transformational political contextual changes have tremendous amount of influence. And I can see why planners continually feel that they don't lead, but yet in many ways they can and do. It's just the opportunity to be able to be savvy on how best to do that. Have I addressed that, you think?
Oh, go ahead.
A follow-up question. I wonder if you can talk, so you're talking kind of broadly about the Department of Human Services and the really wonderful programming they've done. The $500 a month housing benefit that you had mentioned in your presentation, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that as an example of kind of this transformative policy making, how it happened, like just whether you see opportunities for expansion of that, or is that kind of really, how is that, specifically rooted in kind of the cultural local context, if not, or maybe so.
I think it was really bold for them to really ask something like that. And I think it's realizing that Hawaii is either number one or number two in terms of cost of living, right? I mean, people forget about us. I mean, meetings are always held where it's 4 o'clock in Hawaii, so it's like, how can you really participate? I mean, and that being said, I mean, that means that, and we are 80 to 90% importing everything. And petroleum, I think I think they said Russia was number 3 in terms of our importing of oil and petroleum from Russia. I mean, so you see how fragile we are in regard to that. And so by the very nature that they realize that having some kind of continuity in terms of providing the type of support, especially for the 30% AMI and below, is critical. And by the very nature that they're willing to do that, and it's a new program, so they're working out the kinks and seeing how they you know, the question is, how will all this experimentation change without a lot of the federal funding that's come in to galvanize these types of awareness programs to be able to address equity? And I think that all the communities and people who are attending this workshop are really having the same type of challenges, right? It's that everybody feels that at some point in time, the spigot is going to shut down, but how can you figure so for the most enterprising communities, they are probably all well positioned because in the meantime, they've planned, they've pulled two people together, they've done the proper outreach, they've created the partnerships and coalitions, and so they are front and center and they can move forward. But most communities are not so, right? They're all in understaffing issues. You know, they really are trying to take a look at what they've done for COVID and ARPA and funding before that. They're trying to catch up. They're trying to do their final reporting and all that sort of stuff, which makes it extremely challenging in finding that balance in terms of how do you make those transformational changes that we all agree are critical, and at the same time be able to handle the processes that are inherent in anything that's, in this case, led by the federal government. So it's a real conundrum. And that being said, the opportunity to make some transformational changes and address equity is here.
Thank you. A question, or more of a comment, I guess, came in. Reparation is an issue that needs to be addressed in planning. We actually have a webcast that we did at the end of last year. I think it was on November 12th. I just looked this one up. And it's called Reorienting Planners' Values Towards Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We also had another one, I think it was last year, that discussed the Gullah community in South Carolina and what they're doing to give some land back. We also had a recent webcast on working with Native American tribes and working alongside them, reaching out to them, things like that. So we have several webcasts. If you can't find them on our YouTube channel, just email me and I can get you the direct links to those. Super interesting sessions those were, for sure. And then we also had one also, I think it was on Alaska, I think, and it was moving communities due to climate change, but we totally touched on reparation and equity in planning, particularly up in Alaska, and how communities are kind of being devastated by, you know, kind of what goes on around them. So I guess, Ramona, we have time for one more question. Do you have any other questions that you would like to ask?
I think, Mildred, first of all, do you feel that it's time to do those updated surveys? And because you're really good, you have a staff and a team that's excellent in that. Is there a new direction or is it an expanded direction that you folks are going to take at this time from, you know, that long span in terms of how you digested these transformational changes that you're seeing happening or not happening in the communities at large, like your ICMA surveys and stuff? What's the future look like?
Well, it's interesting. We did a planning across generation survey in 2013, and then we did another one in 2019. And we wrote an article that said, why is age-friendly planning stalled? Because we basically didn't see any progress, even on the sort of narrow conceptions of traditional age-friendly. So I think what might be more useful at this, I think we're at potentially, I thought back in 2020 in the summer that we were at a potentially transformational moment.
Yeah.
And now in 2022, I'm not so positive
Yeah.
anymore. But Andy, I think, has got something to say there. But I think we might
So
have.
I just have a lot of thoughts, and I know we have a few minutes left, and I just thinking about that, what I'm seeing in practice at least is a shift away from identity and a discussion around like needs. And what we're seeing out in Seattle is just this discussion around housing, affordable housing, diversity of housing, different housing at your income, and it's taking away this identity. And I think what's interesting about that is I think that's actually kind of powerful sometimes, because a lot of times when we look at like data, and I should have said this and I'm so sorry right at the end, but like we look at data and it's like, oh, this community is this type of community with this type of thing, but it's really like that community lives in a space. They just happen to have those demographics, but that space and that environmental justice issues exists. It's not their fault because of the community. It's the decisions that we've made, the intentional planning, the unintentional consequences of our actions. And so what I'm seeing is a shift, and maybe it's why it's going away from aging. And maybe what, I think you're coming at aging is like, if we plan for aging, we're just going to have better communities. And I kind of have the same argument. If we plan for women by doing better housing, better transportation, the same arguments that Mildred has, we're doing better. So what if what I think was happening is we're removing identity, kind of like the world is losing color. And I don't mean that unintentionally, but that graphic's been through my social media recently. And so I think we're losing identity in planning, and we're moving back towards a shift, I think, at least in practice, towards that. And I think if you want my actual answer, the way to shift paradigms is to shift how we fund things. Like, I think planners can do better. We always say we could do better community engagement. We know how expensive it is. We want to build affordable housing, put money. We can build it. We know how to do it. But I think it's intentional, and it's where the policymakers are in the decisions. So I think, really to be transformational is really to put the money there. And I think that's going to be what the policymakers have to do. But so I think there's a shift. So I don't know. I think that you prompted me on this aging is going away. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm really seeing housing come up, but housing in the context of needs, right? And so I think there's something potentially there. Sorry to throw that in right at the end.
Just throw that in.
Right, that's fine. Well, thanks everybody. This was really great. Everyone, please pay attention. There is something up with the CM system and getting CM numbers in, and I have sent a message to APA. We will figure it out, but no, you cannot log your credits at this moment. So I repeat, you cannot log your credits at this moment. I will email everyone who is in attendance today when credits are available, when they're up and ready for you. I promise there are credits. So I will email everyone when they're up and ready for you to register. Don't forget, we are recording the session, so share it with your friends. We'll post it up onto our YouTube channel. I'll probably get it up sometime on Monday. So just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and we'll pop up. And I think that's it. Ramona, thank you for hosting everybody. We appreciate you, Mildred and Andy and Marissa. Thank you for joining us today and chatting with us on this super important topic. And we hope to have you back again soon. Thanks everybody, and have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you.